The Great Hall of the Celestial Concord. Space station floated between three dying stars, and its crystal walls caught the light and turned it into colors that no human eye had ever seen before. Representatives from 12 alien empires had come together for the annual Summit of Crowns, which was a diplomatic tradition that was older than human civilization itself, and the gathered rulers filled the massive chamber with the sounds of 100 different languages. Princess Valith of the Zerani Dominion entered the chamber, and silence fell across the room like a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. She stood 8 feet tall, and her obsidian black skin was covered in patterns that glowed with soft light, and these patterns shifted and changed with her mood like a living map of her emotions. She had 4 powerful arms that she folded across her armored chest, and her eyes numbered 6 in total, and they were arranged in a crown around her skull, and they looked at the assembled monarchs with cold and calculating intelligence. King Morath of the Velkine Empire took 3 quick steps backward when he saw her, and his green-scaled face turned pale with fear. Emperor Zisith of the Sarathi Collective coiled his long serpentine body tighter around himself, as if trying to make himself smaller and less noticeable. Even the ancient Prelate Omnis, who had ruled the crystalline theocracy for 3,000 years, turned his many-faceted eyes away from her gaze, and he was a being who had watched stars be born and die. But even he could not meet her. Staravelith had earned her terrible reputation through blood and fire and conquest in the siege of Gamma Nexus. She had personally walked onto the bridge of 14 enemy warships and executed their commanders with her own hands while their crews watched in horror in the purge of the Outer Rim. Her fleet had turned 7 inhabited moons into radioactive wastelands, and the survivors still told stories of the princess who walked through fire without fear. She was known across the galaxy by many names, but the most common one was the daughter of extinction, and parents in 1,000 star systems used her name to frighten their children into obedience. At the far end of the hall, there was a small group of humans standing together, and they looked tiny and fragile compared to the massive alien beings around them. Among them stood a young woman named Sophie Grant, who wore the simple gray uniform of the Terran Defense Corps, and she had recently been promoted to the rank of lieutenant commander, which was a big achievement for someone her age. Her presence at the summit was mostly ceremonial, because humanity was still considered a minor power in galactic politics, and their territory only covered 47 star systems, which was nothing compared to the thousands of worlds controlled by the older empires. Sophie watched the proceedings with quiet interest, and her brown eyes moved from face to face. As she studied each alien ruler in turn, she noticed something that the others seemed to miss entirely behind the fearsome display that Princess Valith put on. There was exhaustion hiding in the shadows. Bioluminescent patterns on her skin flickered irregularly like a lamp running low on power, and her movements, while still dangerous and predatory, carried a heaviness that spoke of burdens far beyond simple warfare. Sophie had seen that kind of tiredness before in the eyes of soldiers who had fought too many battles and carried too many scars, both visible and invisible. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Kevin Morris, who was a portly man with a nervous smile and sweaty palms, and he kept checking his datapad every few seconds. As if hoping for rescue, next to him stood Commander Patricia Wells, who was the military attaché, and she stood stiff and formal with her hand never far from her sidearm. Sophie preferred to stand slightly apart from the main group, where she could observe without being observed herself. When Princess Vila's gaze swept across the chamber, it paused on the human delegation for just a moment. Most of the humans looked down or away, just like everyone else in the room had done. But Sophie did not look away. She met those 6 alien eyes with her own 2 human ones, and she held that gaze steady and calm for a fraction of a second. Something passed between them, and it was like 2 predators recognizing each other across a crowded watering hole of Eliths. Glowing patterns shifted to a color that no one in the room had ever seen before, and even her own attendants seemed confused by it then. The moment passed and the princess moved on, and the summit continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and Sophie knew it even if she could not explain what it was. The negotiations that followed were tense and difficult, as they always were. Zirani Dominion was demanding territorial concessions from 3 neighboring empires, and they wanted colonization rights to 17 uninhabited worlds in the neutral zone. The other empires were pushing back because giving in to the Zirani meant appearing weak, and appearing weak in galactic politics was often a death sentence. Sophie listened to the arguments flow back and forth, and she studied the body language of each speaker. Ambassador Morris gave a brief speech about human neutrality and the importance of peaceful resolution, and his words were polite and meaningless, and everyone in the room knew it. When the first session ended, Sophie found herself standing near one of the massive windows that looked out into space. 3 dying stars outside cast everything in shades of orange and red and purple, and the view was both beautiful and sad at the same time. She thought about the look in Princess Belith's eyes, and she wondered what secrets hid behind that fearsome mass commander. Wells approached her with a cup of the weak tea that the station provided to human guests. "You should be more careful," Wells said in a low voice that would not carry to the nearby alien delegates. "Careful about what?" Sophie asked without turning from the window. "I saw you staring at the Zirani princess, and that is not the kind of attention you want to attract." Sophie finally turned to face her superior officer, and she smiled slightly. "She is interesting," Sophie said simply. "She is dangerous," Wells corrected her firmly. "Those 2 things are not mutually exclusive." Wells frowned at her and shook her head slowly. "You have always been too bold for your own good, Grant, and one day that boldness is going to get you killed." Sophie looked back out at the dying stars and thought about a princess who made kings tremble with fear, but who also carried exhaustion in her eyes, like a weight she could never set down. "Maybe," Sophie said quietly to herself when Wells had walked away, "but not today." The summit would continue for 7 more days, and in that time everything would change for both Sophie Grant and Princess Belith in ways that neither of them could possibly imagine. But for now, Sophie simply watched the stars and waited for whatever would come next. She had learned long ago that patience was often the most important weapon a soldier could carry. 3 days had passed since the summit began, and the negotiations had completely stalled. Zirani Dominion continued to demand territorial concessions that no other empire was willing to accept, and Princess Belith's fearsome reputation made the idea of compromise seem impossible. Delegates from different empires whispered to each other in shadowy corners of the station, and the word that kept appearing in their conversations was war. Everyone seemed to think the conflict was inevitable, and it was only a matter of time before the guns started firing again. Sophie Grant had spent these 3 days watching and learning and keeping her thoughts to herself. She attended the official sessions with Ambassador Morris and Commander Wells, but she also wandered the station during her free time, and she observed how the different species interacted with each other. The observation deck was her favorite place on the entire station because it offered a perfect view of the 3 dying stars outside, and there was something peaceful about watching those ancient lights fade slowly into darkness. She found herself walking there during the artificial night cycle, when most of the station's inhabitants were asleep or engaged in private meetings. Her datapad glowed softly as she reviewed tactical reports about Zirani military capabilities, and she was so focused on her reading that she almost missed the voice that spoke from the shadows. "You did not look away." Sophie turned quickly, and her hand moved toward the small knife hidden in her boot. Before she even realized she was doing it, Princess Belith stood barely 10 feet away from her, and in the dim light of the observation deck, she looked even more imposing than she had. In the great hall up close, Sophie could see details she had missed before. Pale Scars crossed the princess's obsidian skin in dozens of places, and each one told a story of a battle survived and an enemy defeated. The bioluminescent patterns on her body cast strange shadows on the walls and floor, and they pulsed slowly like a heartbeat made of light. Should I have looked away? Sophie asked, and she was surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. Every other being in that chamber did exactly that, and even the kings could not hold my gaze. Valith moved closer, and her movements were fluid and graceful like a predator, stalking through tall grass, especially the kings. She added with something that might have been contempt in her voice, "I am not a king." Sophie said. Valith stopped just a few feet away, and all 6 of her eyes studied Sophie with unnerving intensity. "No, you are not a king, and you are a kopie. Soldier instead, because I recognize the way you stand and the way you watch everything around you. And you have killed before, haven't you?" "I have. And yet you do not fear me." Sophie considered the question honestly before she answered, because she believed that honesty was always the best approach, even in dangerous situations. "I respect what you are capable of," she said finally. "But fear requires uncertainty, and I have read your combat records, and I know exactly what you can do, and there is nothing uncertain about it." For a long moment Valith was completely silent, and her patterns shifted through several colors that Sophie could not interpret. Then she made a sound that Sophie's universal translator struggled to process, and it finally labeled the sound as laughter, but there were notes of something sadder mixed in with it. "The other humans on this station send diplomats to speak with me," Valith said. "They send politicians who smile at me while their hearts race with terror, and I can smell their fear even when they try to hide it." She paused, and her pattern settled into a deep blue color. "You are the first human who speaks truth to me. In my experience, truth is more efficient than lies." Sophie replied. Valith's patterns shifted again to that strange unknown color that Sophie had seen briefly in the Great Hall. "I would speak more truth with you, Sophie, Grand of Earth, but not here in this place where others might listen." "Then where?" Sophie asked. "There's a tradition among my people that goes back thousands of years, and when 2 warriors wish to understand each other, they face each other in the circle of honor." Sophie's eyebrows rose slightly with interest. "You are challenging me to a duel. The combat is not to the death," Valith explained. "It ends at first blood, and it is a way to strip away pretense and see the true nature of another warrior." She moved even closer, and Sophie could feel the heat radiating from her alien body. "I am inviting you to a conversation, Sophie Grant, and it is the only kind of conversation I know how to have." Sophie thought about it for exactly 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, she considered all the reasons why she should say no. Commander Wells would be furious, and Ambassador Morris would probably have a heart attack, and the diplomatic consequences could be severe, but Sophie had never been very good at saying no to interesting challenges. When she asked, Valith's patterns flared brightly with what Sophie's translator suggested was pleasure or excitement. "Tomorrow night, and I will send the location to your personal communicator." She turned to leave, but paused and looked back over one of her shoulders. "You are either very brave or very foolish. Sophie Grant and I look forward to discovering which one it is. Maybe I am both," Sophie said with a slight smile. "Then you will fit right in with my people." And then Valith was gone, and she moved so silently that Sophie could barely track her departure. Even though she was watching carefully, Sophie stood alone on the observation deck for a long time after that, and she watched the dying stars and thought about what she had just agreed to do. She knew that she was taking a huge risk, and she knew that things could go very badly tomorrow night. But she also knew that something important was happening here, and she could feel it in her bones. The way a sailor can feel a storm approaching, Princess Valith was not just a monster or a weapon. Despite what everyone else seemed to think, she was something more complicated than That, and Sophie wanted to understand what that something was. When she finally returned to her quarters, she found a message waiting on her communicator. It contained coordinates for a location deep in the lower levels of the station and a single line of text that reads simply, "Do not be late." Sophie smiled and began to prepare for the most important fight of her life. The Circle of Honor was a fighting pit built into the deepest levels of the Celestial Concord Station, and it had existed for hundreds of years before humanity ever reached the stars. Its walls were lined with the ceremonial weapons of 100 different species, and each one had been used in duels that had decided the fate of empires. The floor was made of some dark metal that Sophie did not recognize, and it still bore stains that no amount of cleaning had ever been able to fully remove. Word of the duel had spread through the station like wildfire, and by the time Sophie arrived, the observation galleries were packed with delegates and diplomats and soldiers from every empire represented at the summit. Ambassador Morris had tried to stop her from coming, and he had pleaded and threatened and begged, but Sophie had simply smiled and walked past him. Commander Wells had been more understanding, and she had pulled Sophie aside just before she left. "I still think this is crazy," Wells had said, "but if you are going to do it, then do it right and make humanity proud." Sophie had nodded and shaken her commanding officer's hand, and then she had made her way down to the lower levels alone. Now she stood on one side of the 30-foot ring, and Princess Valith stood on the other side. The alien princess looked magnificent and terrifying at the same time. Her patterns glowed brightly with colors that shifted too fast for Sophie to track, and her 4 arms each held a curved blade that hummed with contained energy. Sophie had chosen a simple combat knife for her weapon, and it was the same model she had carried through the Martian uprising and the border wars. It felt familiar in her hand, and that familiarity gave her comfort. The crowd in the galleries was buzzing with conversation, and Sophie could hear snippets of different languages as alien beings placed bets on the outcome. Most of them seemed to think the fight would last only seconds, and most of them expected Sophie to die or at least be seriously injured. "First blood ends the match," the automated referee announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the arena. "Participants may yield at any time, and the use of lethal force is forbidden." There was a pause, and then the referee spoke again. "Begin." Valith moved like liquid shadow, and her 4 blades created a web of steel that would have overwhelmed any normal defender. The alien princess was fast, and she was strong, and she had been fighting wars since before Sophie's grandparents were born. Sophie had studied Zorani combat techniques on the shuttle ride to the summit, and she had watched dozens of recordings of Valith in battle. She knew that Zorani fighting styles relied heavily on intimidation and superior reach. The 4 arms gave them a massive advantage in close combat, and most opponents tried to stay at distance and use ranged weapons instead. So Sophie did the unexpected, and instead of retreating away from those deadly blades, she advanced directly toward them. Gasps echoed through the observation galleries as the small human charged straight at the fearsome alien Princess. Valith's eyes widened slightly with surprise, but she did not hesitate, and her blade swept toward Sophie in patterns designed to cut her apart. Sophie ducked under the first slash and felt the blade pass so close to her head that it cut a few strands of her brown hair. She sidestepped the second strike and used her shorter height to slip inside Valith's guard, where the longer blades could not reach her easily. For 1 heartbeat they were face to face, and Sophie could see her own reflection in Valith's 6 eyes. Then Sophie's knife moved in a quick, precise motion, and it scored a shallow cut across the princess's lower right arm. Purple blood welled up from the wound and dripped onto the dark floor of the arena. The crowd fell absolutely silent, and the only sound was the soft humming of Valith's energy blades. Valith looked down at the thin line of blood on her arm, and her patterns went through a series of colors that no one in the room could interpret. Then she looked up at Sophie with an expression that might have been wonder or respect or something else entirely. First blood to the human. The referee announced, and there was audible confusion in its synthetic voice. Sophie stepped back and lowered her knife, and she was breathing hard, but she kept her face calm and composed. "Thank you for the conversation," she said. The silence in the arena stretched on for several more seconds, and then Valeth did something that shocked everyone present, even more than her. Defeat she laughed at was a genuine laugh full of surprise and delight, and it was a sound that most of the beings in the galleries had never heard her make before. "This is not over, Sophie Grant," Valeth said as she sheathed her blades. "You have shown me something that I had forgotten existed." "What is that?" Sophie asked, surprise. Valeth walked toward Sophie and stopped just a few feet away, and her patterns had settled into that mysterious, unknown color again. "You will dine with me tonight, and we will speak alone, and I wish to understand how a species so young can produce warriors so bold." Sophie nodded, and a small smile crossed her face. "I would be honored. Honor has nothing to do with it," Valeth replied. "This is curiosity, and it has been a very long time since anything made me curious." In the galleries above, the alien kings exchanged worried glances with each other. For the first time in living memory, someone had made Princess Valeth bleed in single combat, and instead of demanding vengeance or punishment, she had smiled and laughed and invited the human to dinner. King Moreth leaned toward Emperor Zisith and whispered something that Sophie could not hear. Whatever it was, it made the serpentine emperor's tongue flicker rapidly with what looked like nervousness. Something had shifted in the balance of power at this summit, and everyone could feel it, even if they did not understand what it meant. Yet Sophie and Valeth walked out of the arena side by side, and they left behind a room full of confused and frightened rulers who suddenly had no idea what was going to happen next. And that uncertainty was perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. Princess Valeth's private quarters aboard her flagship were nothing like what Sophie had expected to find. She had imagined trophies and weapons in the preserved remains of defeated enemies, displayed on the walls like some kind of grim museum. Instead, the rooms were filled with art. There were paintings that showed landscapes of alien worlds with purple skies and silver forests and oceans that glowed with their own inner light. There were sculptures made of crystal and metal that depicted families gathered together and children playing in gardens. There were holographic displays that showed peaceful scenes from dozens of different planets, and they cycled slowly through images of beauty and tranquility. Sophie stood in the middle of this unexpected space, and she looked around with genuine surprise on her face. "You seem confused," Valeth said as she poured 2 glasses of a luminescent drink that glowed soft blue. "Your reputation suggests different decorating choices," Sophie admitted. "My reputation is a weapon, and perhaps it is my most effective one." Valeth handed Sophie a glass, and then settled into a chair that adjusted itself automatically to accommodate her 4-armed frame. The drink tasted like honey mixed with something citrus, and it was surprisingly pleasant. "Do you know why the kings fear me, Sophie Grant?" Valeth asked. Sophie sat down in a chair across from the princess and considered the question before answering. "Because you have killed thousands of beings across dozens of worlds." "That is what they think," Valeth said, and her patterns dimmed to a soft, sad blue. "But the truth is that I have killed thousands in order to prevent millions from dying." Sophie set down her glass and leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean?" Valeth was quiet for a moment, and her 6 eyes seemed to look at something very far away. "The Zerani Dominion is dying," she said finally. "Our sun entered its final collapse phase 60 years ago. And we have perhaps 2 centuries before our homeworld becomes completely uninhabitable." The words hung in the air between them like a physical weight. "I did not know that," Sophie said softly. "No one outside the Zerani High Council knows, and we have kept this secret with absolute determination because we had no choice." Valeth stood and walked to one of the paintings on the wall and it showed a beautiful city built on the edge of an ocean with spires that reached toward a golden sky. This is Volanthos, the capital city of our homeworld, and 12 million Zorani live there, and they watch their sun grow dimmer each year, and they wonder if their children will ever feel its true warmth. Her patterns flickered with colors that Sophie's translator identified as grief and anger and determination, all mixed together. If our weakness were known to the other empires, they would descend upon our remaining colonies like predators attacking wounded prey, and everything we have built over 10,000 years would be torn apart. She turned back to face Sophie, and there was a rawness in her expression. It seemed completely at odds with her fearsome reputation. So, I became the predator instead, and I made the kings fear us so completely that none of them would dare test our strength. Sophie understood now, and the realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. That is why you have been demanding territorial concessions at the summit. New worlds for my people. Valeth confirmed. A future for the children who will never see our homeworld's true sky. She sat back down heavily, and for the first time she looked tired and old, despite her alien appearance. I have become a monster to save my species, Sophie. Gran and I have done terrible things that haunt my sleep every night. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper, and I am so very tired of being afraid. Sophie stood and crossed the room to stand before the princess, and she reached out and placed her hand on Veleth's upper right arm, just above the wound she had inflicted in the arena hours earlier. You are not a monster, Sophie said firmly. You are a soldier doing an impossible job with the only tools available to you, and I know exactly what that feels like. How can you possibly know? Veleth asked, and there was desperate hope in her voice. Because I grew up on Earth during the resource wars, and I watched my parents die trying to protect our small farm from raiders who wanted to take everything we had. Sophie's eyes grew distant as memories flooded back. I was 14 years old, and I hid in a storage cellar while my mother and father fought to give me time to escape, and I heard them die, and I could not do anything to help them. Veleth's patterns shifted with something that looked like shared pain. I joined the military because I thought if I became strong enough, I could protect everyone who could not protect themselves, and I trained harder than anyone, and I became very good at killing. Sophie smiled sadly. For a long time, I thought that was all I was, and I thought I was just a weapon, to be pointed at enemies and nothing more. What changed for you? Veleth asked. I met someone who looked at me and saw more than just a killer, and they reminded me that the person I was fighting to protect was also the person doing the fighting. Sophie squeezed Veleth's arm gently. You are not just the daughter of Extinction Veleth, and you are also the daughter who loves her people enough to sacrifice her own soul for their future. Veleth's patterns erupted in that mysterious unknown color, and Sophie realized now that it must be some Zorani expression of hope or connection or something the translator simply had no word for. No one has spoken to me like this in 30 years. Veleth whispered, then it is long overdue. They sat together in silence for a while, and the art on the walls seemed to glow brighter, as if responding to the shift in mood. What do I do now? Veleth asked, and for once she sounded like someone asking for genuine advice instead of giving orders. Sophie thought carefully before she answered. You stop fighting alone, and you find allies who can help you. And you trust that not everyone in this galaxy is a predator waiting to attack. That is a very human way of thinking. Maybe. Sophie agreed. But sometimes the human way of thinking is exactly what the galaxy needs. The final day of the Summit of Crowns dawned with an announcement that shocked every empire in attendance. Princess Veleth stood before the gathered monarchs in the Great Hall, and her pattern cycled through colors of peace and diplomacy that many of them had never seen her display before. Beside her stood Sophie Grant, wearing her dress uniform with every medal and ribbon she had earned, displayed proudly on her chest. She looked small next to the towering alien princess, but she did not look intimidated in the slightest. The kings and emperors and prelates watched with confusion and suspicion as these two unlikely figures prepared to speak. "I come before this council to propose something unprecedented," Valeth announced, and her voice carried to every corner of the massive chamber. "The Zerani Dominion faces a crisis that we can no longer hide from the rest of the galaxy." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, and delegates leaned toward each other to whisper their speculation. "Our sun is dying, and our homeworld will become uninhabitable within 2 centuries, and our people need new worlds to survive." The murmurs became louder, and King Morath of the Velkeen leaned forward in his throne with predatory interest gleaming in his reptilian eyes. Emperor Zisith's forked tongue flickered rapidly as he calculated the implications of this revelation. This was the moment of weakness they had all been waiting for, and many of them were already thinking about how they could exploit it. However, Valeth continued, and her voice hardened with determination. "We do not come before you today to beg for scraps or to threaten war, and we come instead to offer partnership." She gestured toward Sophie, who stepped forward to address the assembly. "The Terran Coalition proposes a joint colonization initiative," Sophie said, and her voice was clear and confident despite the hundreds of powerful beings watching her. "The Zerani possess advanced terraforming technology that can transform barren rocks into living worlds, and Earth possesses agricultural sciences that can grow food in conditions that would defeat any other method." She paused to let that sink in before continuing. "Together we can create new homes, not just for the Zerani, but for any species in this room that needs them." Silence fell over the chamber, and it was the kind of silence that comes when people are hearing something they never expected. "Why would humanity do this?" Prelate Omnis asked, and his crystalline voice echoed strangely in the quiet hall. "What possible benefit could you gain from helping your rivals?" Sophie smiled, and it was a genuine smile full of warmth and hope. "Allies," she said simply, "friends, and partners in building a galaxy where survival does not require becoming a monster." She glanced at Valeth, and something passed between them that the watching delegates could not quite interpret, and proof that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is reach out their hand instead of raising their fist. Valeth placed one of her hands on Sophie's shoulder and addressed the assembly again. "I have spent 30 years making the kings of this galaxy fear me, and I did it because I thought fear was the only language that power understood." Her pattern shifted to soft, gentle colors that seemed completely foreign on her fearsome form. "But this human warrior has shown me that I was wrong, and she has shown me that courage is not just the willingness to fight." Her voice grew stronger with conviction. "Courage is also the willingness to be vulnerable, and to ask for help, and to believe that others can be better than their worst impulses." The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and Sophie could see the alien rulers calculating and considering and weighing their options. Then slowly the ancient prelate Omnis began to make a sound that filled the chamber like wind chimes in a storm. It took Sophie a moment to realize he was applauding. One by one the other delegates began to join in, and the applause spread through the hall like a wave rolling across an ocean. King Morath rose from his throne and approached the podium where Sophie and Valeth stood, and his movements were hesitant and uncertain. "The Velkeen Empire has marginal worlds that we cannot develop on our own," he said grudgingly. "If this alliance you propose is genuine, then we would be willing to discuss terms." Emperor Zisith uncoiled his serpentine body and slithered forward as well. "Pasathi knows something of dying worlds, because our ancestors fled a supernova thousands of years ago, and perhaps it is time we remembered what compassion feels like." By the end of that long day, 11 of the 12 empires had agreed to participate in what would come to be called the Galactic Resettlement Initiative. There would be many challenges ahead, and the road would be long and difficult with setbacks and conflicts along the way. But something fundamental had shifted in the galaxy that day, and everyone could feel it even if they could not fully Explain what had changed as the delegates filed out of the chamber. Sophie and Valith remained behind, and they stood together at the great windows, looking out at the three dying stars. You have changed everything, Valith said quietly. No, Sophie replied with a gentle shake of her head. I just reminded you that you wanted to change it, and you did the hard part yourself. Valith's pattern settled into a warm, steady glow that Sophie had come to recognize as contentment. When we first met, you told me that fear requires uncertainty, and I think I understand now what you meant by that. What do you think I meant? I was uncertain whether I could ever be anything other than a weapon, Valith said. I was uncertain whether anyone could ever see me as more than the daughter of extinction, and you showed me that I could be something else. Sophie turned to face the alien princess and reached out to take one of her 4 hands. And you showed me that sometimes the people who seem the scariest are the ones who need kindness the most. They stood together watching the ancient stars fade slowly into darkness. What happens now? Valith asked. Now we build something worth protecting, Sophie answered, and we do it together. Outside the crystal walls of the station, the dying stars continued their slow dance toward oblivion as they had for millions of years before any of them were born. But for the first time in a very long while, those watching the stars had chosen hope over fear. They had chosen partnership over rivalry and trust over suspicion. And that choice made all the difference. It was a very human way of thinking, and perhaps that was exactly what the galaxy had needed all along. The end.